Imagine, you are 12 years old. It is a Tuesday in 1450. You wake up, and you can smell your mother's bread cooking. You can hear your father's axe splitting firewood outside. And then, the drums begin. Ottoman soldiers have arrived at your village. By nightfall, you are gone, taken, and you will never see your family again. But here is the twist that history almost never tells you. In 30 years, you will be the most feared soldier on earth. You will be the weapon that shattered the walls of Constantinople, the blade at the heart of the greatest empire the medieval world had ever seen. You will be a Janissary, and this is how an empire decided that the best soldiers it could ever create were the sons of its enemies. Welcome back. Today we are going inside one of the most revolutionary military institutions in human history, the Ottoman Janissaries. From slaves to sultan makers, from loyal infantry to political kingpins. This is their story, and trust me, it is unlike anything you've heard before. Before we get into the Janissaries themselves, we need to understand the world they were born into. Because without understanding that world, none of this makes sense. It is the mid-1300s. The Ottoman state is young, hungry, ambitious. It started as a tiny Turkish principality in a beylik, northwestern Anatolia, clinging to existence between the dying Byzantine Empire and a patchwork of rival Muslim states. But it had something those rivals lacked: vision. Under Sultan Murad I, who ruled from 1362 to 1389, the Ottomans are expanding fast. Into Thrace, into the Balkans, into Europe. These are not small raids. These are conquests, and conquests need armies. Now here is the problem that every empire builder eventually faces. A problem as old as war itself. How do you build a loyal army? Tribal warriors fight for their chieftains, not their sultan. Mercenaries fight for money and leave when it runs out. Feudal levies fight for season, then go home to plant crops. None of these forces give you what you actually need for a professional empire: discipline, loyalty, permanence. Murad I had a solution, and it was, by any measure, one of the most audacious ideas in the history of military organization. He would take the children of his conquered subjects. He would raise them in the palace, train them from birth, and forge them into something entirely new. A standing army, loyal not to tribe, not to family, not to coin, but to the Sultan alone. He called them the Janissaries, the new soldiers. We call them the Janissaries. The mechanism that fed the Janissary course was called the devshirme, a Turkish word that translates with chilling simplicity as the gathering or the collection. Here is how it worked. Every few years, sometimes every 5, sometimes every 3, depending on the empire's needs, Ottoman officials would ride into the Christian villages of the Balkans, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, Greece, Bosnia. They were not looking for criminals. They were not looking for orphans. They were looking for the best, the strongest boys, the tallest boys, the most intelligent boys. They were looking for the ones with fire in their eyes. Boys between the ages of 8 and 18, drawn from the most capable Christian families the empire had conquered. And the cruelty of it, the particular, specific cruelty that makes this system so hard to reckon with, is that these were not boys from poverty. These were often the sons of village leaders, craftsmen, landowners. The families with the most to give gave the most to the empire's war machine. The boys were converted to Islam. They were taken to Anatolia or to Istanbul. They were evaluated. Again, because the Ottomans ran, perhaps the world's first genuine meritocracy of violence. The sharpest minds, sent to the palace school, the Enderun, where they would learn languages, law, theology, mathematics, and administration. These boys would become viziers, governors, grand viziers, the architects of empire. The strongest bodies? Those went to the Janissary training barracks. And I want you to pause on that for a moment, because this is genuinely radical for the 14th century, in a world where your birthright determined almost every aspect of your life, where the son of a peasant died a peasant, and the son of a lord died a lord. The Ottoman Empire created a system where a Serbian shepherd's boy could, through merit and training and the strange fortune of being taken, rise to command thousands of soldiers. Of course, And this is the part historians debate endlessly. We have to ask, was this opportunity or was it exploitation? The honest answer is, it was both, simultaneously, completely. Some families wept when their sons were taken. Others, and there are documented cases of this, bribed officials to have their son selected, because they understood what their child could become. The devshirme was a wound and a ladder all at once. Once selected, the training began, and it was unlike anything else in the medieval world. Forget everything you think you know about medieval soldier training. Because what the Ottomans were doing with Janissary recruits, called asemi-olanlar, or foreign boys, one was not training. It was transformation. The boys lived communally. They ate together, slept together, prayed together. They were deliberately cut off from their old identities, their Christian names, their family connections, their previous language. The Ottoman system understood something that modern militaries only codified centuries later. Before you can build loyalty, you must dismantle the self that existed before. They were taught archery, not just the mechanics of shooting, but the Zen-like discipline of becoming the bow. They trained in wrestling, in horsemanship, in the use of the sword, the crossbow, and later, critically, the arquebus, the early firearm that would define the gunpowder age. But the physical training was only half of it. These boys were educated. They were taught to read and write in Ottoman Turkish. They studied the Quran. They were given a spiritual framework, Sufi Islam, specifically the Bektashi order, that emphasized brotherhood, devotion, and the sacred duty of the soldier. Their barracks was not just a military facility. It was a monastery, a brotherhood, a second family, deliberately built to replace the one that had been taken from them. And this is the genius, if we can call it that, of the Janissary system. By the time a boy emerged from training, 5, 7, sometimes 10 years later, he was no longer a Bulgarian shepherd or a Serbian farmer's son. He was something entirely new. He was a Janissary. His loyalty was to his orta, his unit, his brothers. His devotion was to the Sultan, whom the Janissaries regarded almost as a sacred figure, a shadow of God on earth. His identity was his function. He was the empire's weapon, and the empire was his world. At their height, the Janissaries were divided into ortas, units, roughly equivalent to modern battalions. They wore distinctive uniforms, tall white felt hats, called burk, that became one of the most recognizable military symbols of the medieval and early modern world. They carried distinctive weapons. They marched to the sound of the meter, the Ottoman military band, which, by the way, is where the entire European tradition of the military marching band originates. Yes, every time you see a marching band at a football game, trace it back far enough, and you will find the Janissaries. The Janissaries were not built for parade grounds. They were built for war, and war found them quickly. Their first major test came at the Battle of Kosovo in 1389. A clash so enormous, so culturally significant, that it is still celebrated or mourned in Serbia today. More than 6 centuries later, the Janissaries formed the iron core of the Ottoman line. When the Serbian cavalry broke through and killed Sultan Murad I himself in the chaos, the Janissaries did not collapse. They held, and then they won. This became a pattern. Outnumbered, they held. Commander killed, they held. Crisis on the flanks, they held, because they had no home to retreat to. The battlefield was their home. Victory was the only acceptable outcome. Battle after battle, campaign after campaign. The Janissaries drove the Ottoman expansion westward, into Bulgaria, into Greece, into Hungary. But all of it was prologue. Because on May 29, 1453, the Janissaries would do something that historians still argue changed the world. Constantinople, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, the city with walls so massive, so thick, so engineered for survival, that they had repelled every attacker for a millennium. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, brilliant and burning with ambition, had spent years engineering this moment. He had the largest cannons ever built dragged overland. He had ships hauled across land on greased logs to bypass a naval chain. He had spent weeks bombarding walls that had held since the 5th century. And when the final assault came at dawn, When the Ottoman army poured toward the breach, it was the Janissaries who led the charge. Byzantine defenders, exhausted after weeks of siege, faced a fresh wave of the world's most disciplined professional infantry. The fighting was medieval in its brutality, hand to hand, stone by stone. And then the walls fell. Constantinople became Istanbul. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, ceased to exist. The balance of power in the known world shifted. Trade routes shifted. The age of European exploration was accelerated because the old Silk Road was now Ottoman territory. All of it. All of those world historical consequences flowing from one morning's fight. The Janissaries were at the center of it. Their reputation, already formidable, became legendary. European powers wrote about them with a mixture of horror and awe. The word spread across every court in Christendom. Do not fight the Janissaries in open battle. You will not survive it. The century that followed Constantinople was, by almost any measure, the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, and the Janissaries were its sharpest edge. Under Selim Free, called Yavuz the Grim, for very good reason, the Janissaries swept into Egypt and Syria, destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate, and brought the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman protection. Selim doubled the size of the empire in 8 years, and then came his son, Suleiman I. You may know him as Suleiman the Magnificent. His own people called him something else, the lawgiver, because to the Ottomans his genius was not conquest. It was order, but he could conquer. Under Suleiman, the Janissaries took Belgrade in 1521, the gateway to Central Europe. They crushed the kingdom of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in February 26, a battle that lasted less than 2 hours and ended a medieval kingdom. They besieged Vienna in 1529 and came terrifyingly close to breaking into the heart of Europe. At the height of Suleiman's reign, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Algeria to the borders of Persia, from the tip of the Arabian Peninsula to the walls of Vienna. It was the largest, most powerful, most sophisticated empire in the world, and its military was a revolution built on the Janissaries. Because here is what the Europeans were only beginning to understand about why the Janissaries were so dangerous. They had embraced gunpowder, while European armies were still debating whether firearms were honorable, whether they cheapened the nobility of combat. The Ottomans gave their Janissaries arquebuses and trained them to use them in disciplined volleys, line after line, fire, reload, advance, fire again. This is what military historians call the infantry revolution, the shift from armored cavalry to disciplined, firearm-armed infantry as the decisive force on the battlefield. The Janissaries did not just participate in this revolution, they were the revolution. They were arguably the first modern army. Think about that. Drawn from conquered peoples, trained in state institutions, paid regular salaries, organized into standardized units, equipped with firearms and drilled in coordinated tactics. Replace the turbans with khaki and the terminology becomes recognizable to any soldier alive today. The Janissaries were a preview of what war would become. But here is the thing about power. Corrupts. Not always quickly. Not always obviously. But always, given enough time, always. The very qualities that made the Janissaries extraordinary. Their brotherhood, their discipline, their institutional strength. These same qualities made them, eventually, existential threats to the very sultans they served. It began subtly, as these things always do. By the late 1500s, the devshirme system had started to break down. Muslim-born Ottomans began to be admitted into the core, which diluted the system of absolute loyalty the empire had so carefully engineered. Janissaries were permitted to marry, to have children, to pass their positions to their sons. And the moment soldiers start thinking about their families, their inheritance, their property, they stop being weapons. They start being a constituency. By the 17th century, the Janissaries had become something the Ottoman state had never intended. A political force. And they knew it. The symbol of Janissary power was their cauldron, the great soup, pots in which the core was fed communally. When the Janissaries overturned their cauldrons, it was a declaration of war against the Sultan, not in the field, in the palace. Between 1600 and 1800, The Janissaries deposed, or murdered, at least 8 sultans. They were the Ottoman Empire's Praetorian Guard, its kingmakers, its de facto veto power over anyone who sat on the throne. Any sultan who tried to reform the military, to modernize it, to introduce new European-style tactics that might reduce Janissary importance, faced an uprising. Sultan Osman II tried to reform the army in 1622. The Janissaries killed him. Sultan Selim III tried to create a new modern force alongside the Janissaries in 1807. The Janissaries killed him too. The core that had built the empire was now strangling it, while European powers were revolutionizing warfare after the 30 Years' War, building professional armies with standardized training, supply chains, artillery coordination, and new tactical doctrines. The Ottoman army was frozen. The Janissaries, who had once been the most innovative military force on earth, had become its greatest obstacle to innovation. They were too powerful to defeat, too embedded to remove, too political to simply replace, until one man decided enough was enough. His name was Mehmed II. He had watched his predecessors destroyed by the Janissaries. He had seen his cousin Selim III murdered. He had spent years on the throne in a careful, patient, strategic silence, building alliances, securing loyalty among other military units, waiting. For years he played the game. He let the Janissaries believe they still controlled him. And then in June 1826 he moved. Mahmud announced the creation of a new, European-style military unit, the İkinci Korps. The Janissaries responded exactly as they always had. They overturned their cauldrons. They poured into the streets of Istanbul. They marched on the palace. But this time, Mahmud was ready. He had positioned loyal artillery around the Janissary barracks. He raised the banner of the Prophet, a symbol so sacred that to fight against, it was to declare yourself an enemy of Islam itself. And he summoned the people of Istanbul to defend their sultan and their faith. And the people came. Artillery opened fire on the barracks. The fires burned for days. When it was over, thousands of Janissaries were dead. Thousands more were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. The Janissary Corps, 4 centuries old, the most storied military institution in the Islamic world, was dissolved by imperial decree. Mahmud called it the Vaka-i Hayriye, the auspicious incident, one of history's most carefully chosen euphemisms for a massacre. And just like that, the Janissaries were gone. In their place, the Ottomans built a new army, a European-style army, with European uniforms, European tactics, and European advisors. It was modernization through annihilation, reform written in smoke and blood. And it was too late. The Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries had built, would survive only another century before, collapsing at the end of the First World War. The weapon that had conquered Constantinople was gone. The empire could not survive the wound of creating it, nor the wound of destroying it. So what do we make of the Janissaries? They were slaves who became kings. They were children stolen and turned into empire builders. They were the most advanced military institution of their age, and then became the greatest obstacle to progress that same age demanded. They were soldiers of astonishing discipline and courage, who became political actors of stunning ruthlessness. They were, perhaps most of all, a reminder of a paradox that runs through all of human history. The thing you build to save you will eventually threaten you. The Praetorians threatened Rome. The samurai threatened the shogunate. The Janissaries threatened the sultanate. Power once given does not stay still. But let's not end on abstraction. Let's end on a human truth, somewhere in the historical record. There is a boy, taken from a Bosnian village in the 1440s. He grew up in barracks he didn't choose. He prayed in the faith he was given. He fought in wars decided by men far above him. He was brave because the system demanded bravery. He was loyal because the system manufactured loyalty. And he helped bring down the walls of Constantinople. Did he grieve the family he lost? Did he feel pride in his Orta, his brothers? Did he die rich or in the dirt or very old in a barracks somewhere? We will never know. But he existed. Hundreds of thousands like him existed. And the world we live in, the borders, the trade routes, the cultural flows, the very shape of what we call the Middle East and Eastern Europe, was forged in part by what they did. That is the power of the Janissaries. That is the weight of the devshirme. That is what it means to build an empire on the shoulders of the children of your enemies. I hope you found this story as extraordinary as I do. If you did, hit that like button. Drop a comment with the part of this history that surprised you most. And if you're new here, welcome. We do this every week. Next time, we're going to look at what happened after the Janissaries fell, how Mahmud's new army performed, and whether modernization actually saved the Ottoman Empire, or just delayed the inevitable. I'll see you then.